The title of my talk, The Shape of Things, Debora Vogel's Theory of Seeing, is a threefold gesture. On the one hand, to Władysław Strzemiński's Teoria Widzenia, which explores the historicity of vision in art. On the other hand, to Barbara Sienkiewicz's Literackie Teorie Widzenia, which undertakes the study of transformation of interwar reality in works of literature. And thirdly, it also inevitably harkens to philosophy, whether to Kazimierz Twardowski's theory of intentionality, Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, or Hegel's aesthetics. Between literature, art, and philosophy, there is language in general, and Vogel's language in particular. Ludwig Wittgenstein posits in his philosophical investigations, quote, "To imagine a language means to imagine a form of life," end quote. This proposition serves as an epigraph of sorts to my discussion of the forms of life that Debora Vogel's theory and praxis present as the notion of the fantastic, artistically, philosophically, and linguistically. I will base my observations on an essay on lived space, dwelling in its psychic and social function, recently published in the Montages catalog. I will also have brief recourses to other essays and poetry. In these essays, as in her critical oeuvre at large, Vogel constructs her intervention at an angle where practices and theories of form-giving not only find themselves under the lens, but also become reflected in the shape of her own theoretical language. My overarching argument is that Vogel's criticism works on the limit of the line of representation in visual art, line of philosophical thought, and above all, the written line of writing. The author herself puts it aptly in the foreword to the Day Figures poetry collection. I quote, "Modern plastic arts have grasped the fact that the surface, contour, and color are simply elements of a particular reality that is being construed in a composition. In poetry, the word obtains the role of line and color. And the word is too strongly bound to the rationalized life. It is too much of a carrier and mediator of needs and orientations in life, and therefore it is more difficult to justify and make comprehensible the role of the word in poetics. It is simply an element of construction of a specific reality." End quote. Vogel takes the paradigm of the visual and extends it to the literary in terms of the line as a cross-section, slicing images in half in her poetry. Examples include the poem entitled Cross-Section. I quote, "There were many days in the glass globe, many suns on two sides, many dusks, dawns, twice a day. A day is a rectangular lump. A block with two suns times 7 is called a week." End quote. Or double line, mimetically representing the dynamic visual language of film and advertisements. Vogel also pursues the visual scheme in montage and lines of spatio-temporality in her prose. Slash of the line cutting and at the same time juxtaposing, for instance, two seemingly disconnected images of the blooming acacias and marching soldiers, or the verticals and horizontals in Vogel's quote-unquote architecture of the world, in her building of the train station. There is a rhythm of line in her criticism, for instance, Pilichovsky's line of difference, as wonderfully analyzed by Karolina Szymaniak in her essay A Third District, Ethnicity, Deterritorialization, Montage, to which one might add Chagall's broken zigzag line as per Vogel, or Marek Wlodarski's versus Fernand Lager's line, or the lines of so many artists belonging to and beyond the artists' group, which Vogel discussed in her essays and reviews in multiple periodicals, such as Nasza Opinia, Sygnały, or Zusztajer. To summarize, this line is both central and on the margins of Vogel's work, which is to say ubiquitous. It delimits and grafts her writing. It is writing itself. And this line is tied with the notion of the fantastic, which shapes Vogel's work. Let me illustrate this by the example of the essay dwelling in its psychic and social function. First, a brief summary is in order. Vogel's thesis in the essay concerns the psychic functions of the dwelling. She traces them from the primitive imaginary, where dwelling served as an entity, quote, to fight against the element, the so-called organic element, against such forces of nature as wind, cold, rain, etc., and the infinity of unshaped, infinite space that may lead to human exhaustion if not resisted. Vogel then continues to the modification of the psychic function in modernity, where what dwelling guards against is the outward mechanization of urban life that leads to a different kind of exhaustion, that of alienation. It might appear paradoxical, Yet the dwelling withstands this mechanization, just like it withstood the storm before, by means of allowing its dweller to tap into her, quote, individual rhythm, end quote, the biological rhythm of movements and actions of inhabiting space that can and should harmonize with the rhythm of the overall social being, rather than be disconnected via its jarring mechanization. Here, one could undoubtedly think of Le Corbusier's famous house as a machine for living. Hence the dwelling's social function, intertwined and flowing out of the psychological one. It is to serve as an institution of membership in society. Providing structure or allowing to find balance is the first social function of dwelling according to Vogel. The second being what she terms the inverted function. That is, when the dwelling is no longer shaped by the dweller, but instead shapes the dweller itself. This is a very rough, general scheme of the richness of the article. Now, in more detail. In the essay, Vogel mentions the quote-unquote lines of style in both the historical development of art from Gothicism to Rococo to modern geometric style, as well as specificities of the line in these styles, and not necessarily just the straight line. Yet simplification of the line, its cool geometric nature, was for Vogel the imperative of the movement of dialectics of the day. In fact, it was the line followed in the search for the form in general, reaching the geometrical stage. The development of such line necessarily has more far-reaching implications on the material culture at large, such as the choice of material for objects and interiors, steel and glass favored over wood, shapes of objects, she gives examples of chair and tea table, and colors of surfaces, the quote-unquote pathos of white wall, or other monochrome basic color of the surface. Vogel's question is whether this tendency for the geometric line with its coolness and stasis, albeit stasis full of rhythm, monotony, could be reconciled with another equally important principle, which she calls quote-unquote longing for the fantastic. That seems to be a need for colorfulness, multiplicity, and negation of monotony. And here we come to an important point that indeed simplicity, that is geometry, is the new fantastic for Vogel, or the fantastic is the new simplicity. This needs a bit more explication. Such a convergence of the line and the fantastic is only possible when one does not confuse the contemporary fantastic with the fantastic in the old times. Here Vogel illustrates by means of a simple anecdote. Going to the bookbinder, she requested the book to be bound in cover that is not, quote, the boring fantastical paper, end quote, the tension between boring and fantastical creating a paradox of sorts. She pointed to the boredom of this old type which was fantastical, yet it is unbearable to the modern sensibility. It does not satisfy the need for color and adventure, but is rather outmoded, inexpressive. Such fantastic did not allow for the general line of the old styles to be singularized. The line had to be universal at all times, for instance in the aesthetic of the Baroque. The new aesthetic of the fantastical might appear to some as overly universalized as well, yet paradoxically enough for simplicity without excess and ornamentation of the universal general line of geometrical style, as embodied in the particular line of objects or interiors, allows precisely for the singularity of style. This singularity of the style for Vogel is based on two possibilities. One, quote, the fantastic of ingenuity or imagination, end quote, the construction of the object, thing, from its own point of view, that is, its facticity. Two, what I would term, quote, the fantastic of rhythm, end quote, and Vogel names the fantastic of asymmetry, not to be confused with the previous stuffy fantastic of arrhythmia. And just like this new fantastic is not to be confused with the old fantastic, it is also not entirely the same, albeit similar to the fantastic in the history of non-Western aesthetics. Here Vogel mentions the triangular schemes of Egyptian human figures, which is interesting since Władysław Strzemiński in his theory of vision also talks about stereometrics and architectonics of shapes, such as triangles in Egypt or squares in medieval times, as principles of composition and the historical development of artistic vision. Yet the geometry of new aesthetics in Western art and modernity does not equate with the older geometry for Strzemiński, and Vogel would agree. He does not say this explicitly, yet it could be inferred that if we were to think about Malevich's visible square, for instance, and the invisible yet present square in the visual organization of human figures in other eras, there would be a significant difference, which is measured by the whole teleological line of development of the history of art. Malevich's figure is the embodiment of the crisis of representation in art, where the dichotomy between subject and object is eliminated, yet traced in the line of the square, line which is self-reflexive of the fact that it is in crisis. Thus the line that becomes more elliptical, yet nevertheless all the more traceable in Szymiński's Unism, for example. In the figurality of the historical civilizations, the dichotomy between the subject and object exists, and the history of art moves along the line of mimicry or verisimilitude to nature, only to perpetuate its own crisis of representation later. The art of old is not yet self-reflexive of its own enterprise, a reflection that could be reached only in philosophical terms embodied in modern art, which first needs to go through the whole course of its history. Yet although art embodies this philosophical reflection, it does not become philosophy. It stays art, although art posts its history. This brings us back to the fantastic and to the line. Vogel turned the new aesthetic of geometry, which she analyzes in the presently discussed essay on dwelling in the sphere of applied arts, the quote-unquote fantastic of ingenuity or imagination. What precisely this may mean merits more commentary with recourse to philosophy. In order to understand Vogel's geometry, we have to think briefly on the origins of geometry, not only in art, but geometry as science that, like philosophy, which is a science dealing with truth, was also preoccupied with distilling its own geometrical truth from pre-geometrical experience and transmitting its geometrical ideal objectivities throughout history. What links the origins of geometry out of non-geometry as science and philosophy, namely in Husserl's phenomenology with a commentary by Derrida, and Vogel's interest in geometry and art, is the same link as between such seemingly disparate fields as art, geometry, science, philosophy, and literature, namely the question of language. Let us start with geometry in order to arrive at language. According to Husserl, we must say that geometry is both a material science and an abstract one at the same time. It deals with the thingly, corporeal determination of objects, yet it has to disregard the material, sensible qualities of independent and concrete objects, their material objectivity, in order for the pure or objective ideality of the science of geometry to emerge. It is the road from pre-geometrical inexactitude to geometrical exactitude. This may be explained in how the first geometer, let's say, begins to think of geometrical shapes that lead to the ideality of geometrical concepts. The ideality of the circle, for instance, is constructed from what Husserl calls, quote-unquote, pure phenomenological type, that of roundness. Roundness has already certain constitutive ideality, since it is not the multiplicity of natural shapes that only more or less correspond to it in empirical reality and perception. These shapes are only more or less round, so roundness has to be subtracted from them in order to be pre-geometrically idealized. It is done by imaginative intending, as per Husserl, which harkens to the influence of Kazimierz Twardowski on Husserl, namely the work on the content and object of presentations, where Polish philosopher distinguishes between object and content of presentation that allows him to solve the problem of controversial objects, divorcing the question of existence from the question of presentation via recourse to psychology that Husserl famously rejected after Twardowski. For Husserl, it is imaginative intentionality that provides a morphological type of roundness from sensible shapes. Yet in turn, this morphological shape of roundness on the pre-geometrical level needs to be construed geometrically, and is done via activity conceivable in the sense of Cartesian intellectualism that divorces itself from both imagination and sensibility. Husserl writes, I quote, "In the intuitively given surrounding world, by abstractively directing our regards to the mere spatio-temporal shapes, we experience bodies, not geometrical ideal bodies, but precisely those bodies that we actually experience, with the content which is the actual content of experience. No matter how arbitrarily we may transform these bodies in fantasy, the free and in a sense Ideal possibilities we thus obtain are anything but geometrical ideal possibilities. They are not the geometrically pure shapes which can be inscribed in ideal space, pure bodies, pure straight lines, pure planes, other pure figures, and the movements and deformations which occur in pure figures. Thus, geometrical space does not signify anything like imaginary space." End quote. Husserl seems to be echoing here part 13 of Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, where Kant writes, I quote, "The propositions of geometry are not the results of a mere creation of our poetic imagination," end quote. And here it should be noted that Kant uses fantastique as the word for imagination. For Kant, the fantastic is the fantastic of poetic imagination that is different both from the empirical reality of sensibility and geometrical ideality. In the footnote which juxtaposes Husserl's mention of the fantastic alongside Kant's fantastic, Derrida comments on the difference between the two, which is rooted in the difference in understanding how the sensible, the imaginary, that is the fantastic, and the ideal are connected. For Husserl, the sensible that we encounter in spatio-temporal bodies is reflected via imagination, and precisely therefore cannot be part of the ideality. For Kant, the sensible and the ideal are connected by passing the imaginary, that is the fantastic. He writes, "Geometry is not imaginary, fantastique, because it is grounded on the universal forms of pure sensibility, on the ideality of sensible space." Derrida introduces further nuance in Husserl's view as different from Kant. I quote, "Access to the origin of sensible ideality, a product of imagination, would also require, then, a direct thematization of imagination as such. Now the latter, whose operative role is nevertheless so decisive, never seems to have been sufficiently inquired into by Husserl. It retains an ambiguous status. A derived and founded reproductive ability on the one hand, it is, on the other, the manifestation of a radical, theoretical freedom. It especially makes the exemplariness of the fact emerge, and hands over the sense of the fact outside of the factuality of the fact. Presented in the crisis as a faculty that is homogeneous with sensibility, it is simultaneously uprooting morphological ideality from pure sensible reality." End quote. Derrida's student, Catherine Malabou, wrote a book on the fantastic and philosophy, suggesting philosophy might be fantastical thinking, or thinking of the fantastic. This might be seen as different from Kant's understanding that poetry is the thinking of the fantastic, not philosophy. Based on her readings of a different philosopher, Heidegger, readings suggesting that this philosopher is a thinker of change, which is simultaneously an exchange, Malabou suggests that philosophy, indeed, might be the fantastical thinking, because it is tied to the imaginary, I quote, "insofar as, because it is itself included in the crossing that it must think, it can only imagine what it thinks." End quote. For her, the fantastic has something to do with the fact that there are both metaphysical and non-metaphysical aspects of everything, that real is connected with the phantasm, and, quote, "the fantastic is another dimension of the real image of thingness, or the new face of the entire world." End quote. In another article, Malabou even calls certain philosophical works by Levinas, Nancy, and Sartre, quote-unquote, "the fantastical works of philosophy," insofar as they manifest the question of visibility and invisibility of existence. Malabou states that, quote, "the fantastic for Levinas is the mode of being of what does not exist, and thus of existing itself." Levinas asks, how can we approach this existing without existence? And his response is, by an act of imagination. End quote. It is not my intent to demonstrate that Vogel imagines or thinks along similar lines with Kant and Husserl and Twardowski or any other philosophers. It is clear enough that Vogel received rigorous philosophical training, and that enabled her to undertake various philosophical problems. In Professor Wartenberg's seminar in Jan Kazimierz University, she wrote a paper, "Does Kant rightfully protest against being charged with idealism?" And in Twardowski's class, Vogel discussed in writing the concept of form in art. Yet she was not a systematic philosopher, as many others, trained and later continuing the legacy of the Lwów, Warsaw School of Logic, especially mathematical logic. And hers is not a system or theory of the fantastic, but rather, quote, "a manifestation of radical theoretical freedom," end quote, as Derrida says of Husserl above, in her poetics of the fantastic. What Vogel calls the quote-unquote fantastic of imagination and geometrical line is as much poetic as it is the theoretical freedom of philosophizing on the facticity of things. This theoretical freedom and poesis of the fantastic, which is not a concept, could be said in the words of Catherine Malibu, quote, the uncanniness of the fantastic to itself, its irreducibility to a genre or category of discourse, its resistance to every relegation of itself to a conventional domain, to what Roger Caillois calls, quote, the fantastic of principle or obligation, end quote. Vogel writes about the fantastic only twice in her prose, in separate montage chapters not part of the Acacia's Bloom collection. She writes about it mostly in her poetry. It appears 6 times in the Day Figures collection and 6 times in the Mannequins, in the sense of the paradigm of the visual in writing. For instance, when she writes about signs advertising commodities. The fantastic makes an appearance in Vogel's critical oeuvre in the sense of the line in her reviews of Feyerings, Streng's, Pilihovsky's, and Marc Chagall's artistic work. Yet there is a thread in her writing, a suggestion that the line of fantastic is not only visual, but literary as well. She mentions the fantastic connected to the new legend of the city in her essay, The Legend of Modernity in Children's Literature, as something that Polish author Ewa Szelborg has captured in her children's literature. And the fantastic is present not only in the legend of the city in a book, but as an actuality in the real city. Vogel's description of Stockholm in City Without Cares can, in that sense, be compared to the theoretical and poetic descriptions of the port of Marseille in Siegfried Kracauer's natural geometry essays in his collection The Mass Ornament. This description of the fantastic in Stockholm, linking the visual and the poetic, could serve as an epigraph to the essay on dwelling and to our discussion in general. Vogel writes, quote, the grayness needs a reagent, and so the fantastic arises. The fantastic is uncompromising, as life itself. The colorfulness of the interiors and colored boxes of houses, the silver azure of poetry, thick and dense paint of images. These are all gestures that are not accidental. They are expressions of situation with color, end quote. The fullest exploration of the fantastic of the simplicity of geometrical line in the arts is Vogel's essay on dwelling. And in her foreword to her Day Figures collection, written roughly at the same time as the essay on white words in poetry, she affirms further that the fantastic in language and literature goes together with the fantastic in the arts. In White Words in Poetry, Vogel writes, I quote, in the construction of simple and white words that are analogous to cool geometrical ornament, there is seemingly no place for the element of the inexpressible and for the distance of perspectives. Everything here is about mass, number, count. Everything is about balance and stasis, closedness, fixed boundaries, without intimations about the unsaid. And it sounds like a paradox when one speaks here of the fantastic. One thinks that the fantastic and numbers are mutually exclusive things. And yet in cool, measured, and simple constructions there is an element of the fantastical. Gray color and geometrical line, banal words are condensations and last stages of the dynamic colorfulness which impacts them further. And therefore, one should note the elements of novelty of such constructions, and the wonder with which one can easily, with a couple of simple elements, fit the space into the boundaries of a construction, end quote. Roger Caillois, a thinker of the fantastic, explored the fantastic specifically in literature and poetry, thinking also about the pictorial works. He excludes from the category of the fantastic the works that deliberately intend to produce the fantastic. I quote, the first rule that I give myself is to exclude what I call the fantastic that tries too hard. Those works of art purposely created in order to surprise. The marvels of fairy tales, legends, and mythology, the painting of Hieronymus Bosch, the delusions of the demented mind, indulgent fancies, the masks of Tibetan demons, the avatars of Vishnu, skeletons, hell, sorcerers. I let myself entertain, he pursues, the dream, unreasonable I am afraid, of a permanent and universal fantastic, end quote. Catherine Malibu attempted to find what Caillois calls the quote-unquote permanent and universal fantastic in what she calls the philosophical fantastic. Our preoccupation is different. Can we find the fantastic that Caillois described, the fantastic, quote-unquote, that does not try too hard and can be universalized on a certain level? Can we find such fantastic where he looks for it, namely in poetry and literature? Kahlua says, quote, "The fantastic, in my sense, does not come from an element outside of the human world. Composite monsters, infernal fauna, the eruption of the demonic, grotesque or sinister creatures. It emerges from a contradiction that bears upon the very nature of life, and that obtains nothing less than the appearance of momentarily abolishing, by means of its vain but troubling prestige, the border that separates life from death." End quote. Debora Vogel certainly did not read Kahlua, but is it just possible that her theory of seeing, in fact, foresaw the fantastic in literature, the fantastic that Kahlua would only later speak about? In her essay on the dialectical novel, where Vogel analyzes Austrian writer Rudolf Brugraber's novel Karl and the 20th Century, a novel that is built on lists of numbers and enumeration of facts, she writes, I quote, "Objective dates and facts here constitute a different kind of fantastic, different in comparison to the fantastic of dreams and colorfulness of human fates, which always contains the unforeseeable. And precisely this new form, this fantastic of banal gestures and numbers, triumphs in the novel due to its colorfulness, over the colorfulness of the so-called life, over these intangible, incomprehensible matters that we nevertheless understand so well, over the matters called life." End quote. Is it possible that Vogel herself foresaw the fantastic, that does not, as per Kahlua, quote, "abolish the border between life and death," end quote, but rather makes this border, partition, threshold, line visible in writing that traces, and at the same time, the history of art, geometry, philosophy, and the history of writing itself? I will not answer this question, but rather let Vogel speak or write herself. Spheres of glass. Yellow spheres of voluminous lamps, which between bronze red leaves are like long sighs, a remainder of days, fantastical like ellipses. And like imagined oval spaces with encounters that fall on the streets like heavy drops of color. Round lamps can be large tears that come on days, monotonous like spheres, when one walks and winds up nowhere. On the streets, dull like circles. Lines of circles have given up longing. But in lonely streets, decorated with lanterns, on evenings that are forever lost, the round glassiness of lamps is fragrant, with their clear, flowing coolness, sweet coolness of rectangles, and strict, odd numbers. Then, the breath of round glass caresses with its cool dimensions of geometrical figures, figures that are forever calm. Thank you.